discussion. Thank you everybody for coming to this particular panel discussion, and thank you the participants of the discussion for accepting this invitation and probably sacrificing part of your free time, given that it is Valborg and night, and you came here. It is highly appreciated that you guys found time to come here. Thank you. So today we will discuss Sweden-Ukraine relations in the light of the presidential elections. And in fact, today, sorry, I just wanted to record everything. Okay. And in fact, today we received the information from the Central Electoral Commission that the results have been finalized in a way, all the votes have been counted, and now it is official that 73.2% of voters, which is about 13.5 million, actually voted for Volodymyr Zelensky, who is now our president-elect. And Poroshenko received support from 24.5% of the voters. So altogether, it is 4.5 million of voters who came to the polling stations who supported Poroshenko. So overall, we can say that turnout was pretty high for Ukraine, so it was 61.4%. Altogether, 18.5 million came to the polling stations to cast their votes for one or the other candidate. And now we are to expect inauguration within 30 days from today. These are the opening kind of messages or the opening points that are probably important to bring in. And we have a very exciting panelists today. I will present you one by one. So we have Maria Nilsson, who is a representative of Liberalerna. Also, Maria is currently a member of the Swedish Parliament since 2018. She is my colleague. She has a MA degree in political science, and her focus is post-Soviet countries. And Maria, you also lived in Crimea for 1 year, right? Yes. From 2005 until 2006, which is very interesting and exciting in the current framework. Then we have Martin Rosén. Martin, you are Deputy Director at the Department for Eastern Europe and Central Asia at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and responsible for relations between Sweden and Ukraine. So again, fantastic to have you here because you are the person who is responsible for Swedish politics towards Ukraine. Well, or maybe that is great, you know. So, and you've been working with the area or with this region since 2009. But also not only with Eastern Partnership countries, but also with Russia. And you also served in European External Action Service, but also in the Embassy of Sweden in Georgia. So welcome here, very exciting to have you. Then we have Alina Zubkovic. She's a former postdoc researcher at Center for Baltic and East European Studies at Stockholm University. And she conducts research on Crimean Tatars and internally displaced persons in Ukraine in relation to the annexation of Crimea. And also she is a deputy director of the Ukrainian Institute in Sweden and also vice president of Unga Ukrainare Sverige. Welcome. We also have Göran Patterson, who is our long-term friend, so to say. He is not new to our organization and we are not new to having these different relations in terms of presentation, etc. Göran is a former member of Swedish Parliament from 2006 until 2018. He was a member of Moderaterna. And he was also serving as a Swedish delegate to the Parliamentary Assembly and also Parliamentary Assembly to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe and NATO as well from 2014 until 2018. He's also a fellow of Royal Swedish Academy for War Science. Welcome, Göran. And last but not least, we have Yulia Yurchuk, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Stockholm University. Yulia is a historian herself, and her project, her research, relates very much to the question of religion and politics in Ukraine, as well as religious actors in the past and the present. So welcome everybody. My name is Karina Shokich. I am a spokesperson of Ukrainian youth in Sweden, and also I'm a research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And today we have two organizations who actually helped organize this event. It is Ukrainian Youth in Sweden and also Utrikespolitiska föreningen at Stockholm University. So thank you very much for helping organize this particular event. So I propose we start this conversation. It will be taking place in a form of questions and answers format. So I will have my questions asked about general reflections about the elections, how they were conducted, but also the current situation in Ukraine. And we will finish with a discussion of Swedish-Ukrainian relationship, the current format and the future possible formats of cooperation. And then I will open up for questions from you guys, from the audience. And then we will have exciting part, catering. Cool. So then my first question is to everybody of you guys, and I just want to ask you, what are your reflections about the electoral campaign and about the results of this election? What are your major takes on it? Maybe you learned something that you didn't expect to learn from this process. So what are your impressions, very briefly, if you can share? Maria, can you start, please?
I had hoped to go there for the first round, but unfortunately I could not be there. So I've been following this from Sweden and through the eyes of my friends. And I think that I have a few points that I want to share. The first is, as I think we all want to mention, is that it was a fairly democratic election, or not fairly, it was democratic election by almost every organization that monitored it, and I think that's an achievement in itself. I was probably as surprised as everyone by Volodymyr Zelensky and his landslide victory. I think that the Ukrainian people was exhausted, frustrated with the corruption, and they did not feel that things were moving in the right direction, and therefore they turned to something completely different, a person with no political background, no political baggage. And there he was. My main question is, what is his political project? Because as a politician, you need a political project. You need a political reform agenda that goes beyond fighting corruption. And that is my big question mark when it comes to Volodymyr Zelensky. What is his political project?
Yes, Martin?
Okay, yes, thank you. For us, of course, as another government, we care a lot about the process and not so much about the result. At least that's what we comment on. So we were also happy to see elections that were well organized, calm, and also competitive. I think this is a line that we have, that you very much can judge the quality of an election by whether you know in advance who will win or not. And in Ukraine, in fact, before the first round at least, we had it was a very open race, we could say. So the vector is clear. This was a step forward, I think, for Ukraine as a democracy. Another election that was good and that was probably better than past ones in many respects. I would really urge everyone to actually read the excellent report by the UDIR election mission, because there are a lot of things there still to be addressed, and we should not forget this when we celebrate the quality of the elections. I think there are a few quite serious shortcomings, actually. A few of them are in the legal domain. I think there are some gaps when it comes to campaign financing law, for example, and also these silent periods were not really observed. If you also look at social media, things were still going around there. Of course, the allegations of vote buying is also something that we see as quite serious, and something that would need to be addressed by legal means somehow. Partisan media is another thing that's addressed in the ODIHR report, which is, I mean, this is not really about media freedom as we see it. That is not a huge problem in Ukraine. This is more about that every candidate seems to have their own media outlet, which is very partisan in favor of that particular candidate, and that leaves a void somehow where the actual political issues are addressed and the political programs of the candidates are compared in a fair way. So those are some things that we would really hope that Ukraine addresses ahead of future elections. So now I talked a lot about the bad things, but I want to just go back to my first message, that it was a fairly good election and better than past ones. As for the results, I mean, I was also not in Ukraine, I was in Stockholm. I think, like you, there was a certain, I mean, I know there are a lot of people with Ukrainian roots, or maybe even who are only here temporarily in Sweden, and I'm sure when you speak to friends and relatives, you will very rarely hear them say that my life has improved significantly because of reforms carried out in the past 5 years. And I think this is really the key, and it's something we've seen in polls for years, that I mean, people they know that reforms are being carried out, but very few people would say that, you know, it has improved my life somehow, and we see living standards and so on are not really improving in the way that I think a lot of Ukrainians had hoped back in 2013 and 14. So there was a desire for a new face, and then I would say for Zelensky that he's been very innovative and skillful in communicating. That's probably also a key, I would say. But I will stop there and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you. Lina?
Well, yeah, Ukraine is an interesting case of transformation regime, and it is always very interesting to observe what is happening with the country since 2014. It never stops me surprising, it is. We must admit that their elections were highly competitive. We didn't know the results. It was quite unpredictable, even though their exit polls were showing that Zelensky has quite high support. A lot of my colleagues didn't believe till the end that that we would have another type of politician in the arena. But this is all part of the democratic process. This is part of the new way of attracting people with new messages, and Zelensky as the project or as the candidate, he was able to attract the protest electorate and basically accumulated the anti-rating of Poroshenko. That means that Poroshenko didn't have that much support, and the messages were rather messages were rather traditional and conservative, and so this is something that doesn't work anymore, probably. That has to be reflected as well. Of course, it is unclear much about his program, because during his campaign he didn't tell much on his program. So we are quite unaware of many things in terms of his next political steps, but hopefully he will have time to attract experts who would really say what is his general line and what are the main things that he would like to change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Göran?
Of course, the campaign was low on policy substance, but that could be said about many elections the last decades. But I would point on two things which I find very positive. One is that the sitting president very quickly declared that he had lost. And if we now can see a peaceful transfer of power, that is one of the best signs of a working democracy, where the losing side steps down and hand over after an election. And the other positive, since I'm a former member of parliament, I'm a little bit freer, so I will comment on the results. one thing which I find very positive in these election results compared with earlier election results in Ukraine is that we don't see as strict ethnic voting. So the winner has won in all regions, which may mean that he comes in with a mandate which is from Ukraine and not from ethnic groups, which I think could be very important in the future.
Indeed. Julia?
And it seems that I'm the only one who was not surprised at all with the result. And I will tell why, because Zelensky is very famous Instagrammer. And during winter, he had this huge flash mob on Instagram. I'm from Ukraine, and I was just shocked then that it was so popular. So during winter, during this flash mob, I understood that if he comes to be a candidate, he has a chance, really. And after the first round, I was in Ukraine actually for a week, and I was speaking with people like in the taxi and everywhere. They all seemed supporting Zelensky, but none of my friends, none of people who are like in universities were saying that they were supporting Zelensky. So it was a clash of I don't know, interests or backgrounds, but it's very interesting to see this clash as well. And when I was looking at this campaign, what was also striking for me that they took very different approaches. So that Poroshenko, he was speaking about what he has done. So it was language, church, the church independence, and the army. What he actually reformed in a way, because we didn't have any army, right? But Zelensky was wiser, or I don't know, but like maybe more smarter in this way, because he was speaking only about future. He has nothing to speak about in the past because he's not in the politics at all. But he was speaking about promising the new life without any kind of substance inside. And it was such a good strategy because everyone could see themselves in this forum, so that the taxi driver could see his dreams in this forum, which was like without any content. And my niece, who is 20, who could see her dreams, which were maybe different, but they could see it in one person, which is very interesting. And as a historian, I was also, and I tend to think all the time about the past. So this election reminded me actually about the first election in Ukraine, 1991, when it was pretty much the same situation when 23% of people voted for a former dissident who was like for language, for like maybe ethnic dimension, and but majority, 63% then, voted for Kravchuk, who was in the system, who was representing more secure like path to the country. So I think that of course now I don't know what Zelensky is, so I cannot see any other parallels. But for me, this numbers were striking. They were the same: 25% for Poroshenko, 23% for Chernovil, and also the fact that then Halichina was like the most western part of Ukraine, were voting for Chernovil, and now this is the part which was voting for Poroshenko. So for me it was like wow. Like
yeah, thank you. That's very interesting historical parallel. Therefore, it's so important to have historians in such panels. Fantastic. And yes, of course, as everybody of you mentioned, that's pretty difficult to talk about what Zelensky, President-elect Zelensky, will do when he takes the office, because he doesn't have a clear program, he doesn't have any clear political statements. They are more like slogans rather than clear plans. That we cannot cover, of course, but what do you think would be his major challenges, right? I mean, there are numerous obvious ones. The ongoing war, Crimea is occupied, the permanent issues with Crimean Tatars, right, whose rights have been violated on the daily basis. And already today we received the news that yet another couple of Tatars they were arrested, and some searches, violent searches, took places in their homes. So that is of course something that we've been living with for 5 years. But what else do you see as new and challenging issues for him and his campaign? Who wants to start?
Well, I mean, he has. Thank you very much. I learned a lot. Thank you. Because when we listen to the definitions of Zelensky, I would say he's been compared to both Trump and to Macron. And I would say that there are slight similarities in both aspects. I mean, Trump, very similar in terms of the non-existing message or very light message. And when it comes to that, people project all that they want to see in this person. And I believe that's a risk, because that is probably what a large number of the Ukrainian population has done now. They have projected all their wishes, their hopes in Zelensky. And now he has a great task to live up to them. And of course, when they projected all these hopes and desires and wishes, the potential of failure is also great. So in the message, the simplicities in the messages, he's very similar to Trump. In Macron, I would say the way that he engaged the younger generation of Ukraine, there are similarities to En Marche, the movement in Ukraine or in France. But I would say his main challenges now, apart from what you mentioned, is actually to show that he has done something, that he has actually contributed in very concrete ways to improving the lives of everyday Ukrainian. And that's not so different to any other politicians around the world. But that's his main challenge, I would say.
I do agree, because of this hollow form, it's a challenge to fill in it now. So because this all people who voted for him, they projected different wishes. So now it's really a challenge to live up to all these different visions, because sometimes these visions can be very, very different, like totally opposite.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I think this is the main challenge, but of course there are challenges which are from 2014, so the war it's still on. So it is not that Zelensky came to some vacuum, there are still ongoing problems.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with what you have both said, that of course if 70-something% of the population votes for one guy, they do that for slightly different reasons. And it's impossible to satisfy all of them. The other challenge, of course, is that Ukraine doesn't really have a strong presidency when it comes to especially economic policies and so on. So he will need support from the old parliament until October, and then he will need after October support from a new parliament, and this is of course a challenge. That, I mean, if, like we have said, it's very much about improving the daily life of people. That's what expected, but this is really something that the parliament has to deliver, and there's of course that is of course a big challenge. Along with, I mean, we cannot forget, of course, the illegal annexation of Crimea and the Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine, which aside from being costly, it just requires an enormous amount of political capital to spend a lot of work and a lot of your time on this every day. as the commander-in-chief of Ukraine, which makes it difficult to do anything else, I think. So those are the main challenges, I would say.
I think that, I would agree with everyone that the most difficult for him will be to live up to the expectations, and since those expectations could be quite contradictory, because I like this analogy that he is a mirror or a reflection, so everybody can just put any content to him. And therefore, yes, he has attracted all those visions together. But since his electorate support was also yours, I hope that it will be important for him to still stay on the line of European integration and all these general trends that Ukraine has brought to the discourse in 2014 in the Euromaidan. So this general line stays there, and also what they have learned from those very brief comments by him or his team regarding Crimea, for example, is that, well, he states that he is going to continue the same trajectory. Well, and as for other things, of course, he has to finish something that was not finished or done by Poroshenko. This is the fight with corruption, and well, or more, I hope that he will establish the anti-corruption court, which is the very important issue at the moment, and some other things that are also very speaking, like land privatization. That's because we still have the state monopoly on that, so generally continuing that all those trends that were declared by Poroshenko but were not done before.
Right.
Even if Zelensky is not as experienced politician as Macron was there, when he was elected, there is a lot of similarities if I compare on the parliamentary side, because after Maidan there came a new breed of parliamentarians into Ukrainian politics, people who have been successful in other professions outside politics, who more on idealistic track choose to run for parliament. And I followed them in OSCE and NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and I could see they getting more and more disillusioned because they gave up good professional careers to do something for the country serving in parliament. And I saw a similar thing, but in the other order in France, because when Macron was elected, he created more or less a party who then won in a landslide in parliament. And in came a new breed of French parliamentarians who understood modern economics and things like that, and who was educated outside of politics. And of course, Macron had run into a problem when the plan meets reality. But I think there is a good chance, because Zelensky has not run on the program, and the way the constitution is, it is not the president that should have the policy. It actually come from the parliament, and he should be more a moral leader, and of course in security and things like that. So if he plays that correct, and he has been able to lead things, because he has created successes outside of comedy, because he's created a successful business outside of politics. So if he is able to use the power of a new breed of politicians, I think there is a chance that you could create policy after you are elected.
Yes, indeed. And of course, President-elect Zelensky will have many troubles. You mentioned almost everything that he will need to deal with, of course, and that is a huge demand that people project into him, but also these new challenges, right? For instance, recently Putin announced that, Russian passports will be issued in the occupied areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. And then he even adjusted his comments, saying that, they had plans to provide everybody with Russian citizenship from Ukraine, whoever wants to apply, which also probably tests or is meant to test Zelensky, his temper, his reaction to such events, because it's a clearly provocation, right? And he seemed, exactly as Alina says, he seemed to try at least carry on the line of foreign policy that Poroshenko had. Right, so Zelensky publicly endorsed, and in his social media, he endorsed some positions of current Ukraine foreign minister. For instance, he retweeted his messages when it came to a few issues, which clearly shows this continuity, which probably is a little bit calming down for me personally. So that's good to know that no dramatic changes will be conducted in terms of foreign policy, but also approach to the ongoing conflict or war. Let's call things the name war in the east of Ukraine, of course. And you mentioned already this question of foreign policy, and Poroshenko in his program and electoral campaign, he had this very clear statement that, well, I am the one who set in stone the Euro-Atlantic integration project into the constitution. I'm the one who was ready to take this sharp statement, right, and set in stone the foreign policy direction for Ukraine for the forthcoming years. Zelensky doesn't have this clear definition of what he wants to do. On the one hand, he says, like, yes, I do support Euro-Atlantic integration, I do support European Union and Ukraine being a member state of European Union, but we need to have a referendum on that, right? So do you think that there are any risks and challenges coming in this particular rhetoric? Do you think that is something that could potentially have an impact on foreign policy in Ukraine, or given the support of European integration ambitions of Ukraine, and broadly these have been supported by Ukrainian population, this has nothing to do with reality, and this is just a beautiful word that Zelensky says. Do you think that we have anything to fear in terms of foreign policy?
Okay, I can maybe start on this one. I mean, Sweden is a country that we have very broad support, I would say, in the Parliament for EU enlargement broadly for all European countries that fulfill the criteria, including Ukraine. I mean, this is a general policy line that we have. I think for Ukraine, it's of course it's welcome with clear aspirations to join the European Union, and even institutionalizing this in the constitution is also fine. I would say it doesn't make much of a difference in practical terms, though, how many times you make this statement or where exactly you write it down. And I think what Ukraine really needs to do in order to actually practically get closer to an eventual EU membership at some point in the future is to work on the content of EU integration, which is codified, as you know, in the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. And this is really, I mean, something that I think not only Sweden but all EU countries and the European institutions as well are conveying quite clearly to Ukraine now, that, you know, it is fine to have a high ambition, but it is also a lot of hard work that needs to be done to make that ambition reality. And this is not unique for Ukraine. I mean, it's the same for every country that has ever joined the European Union, including Sweden that joined later. Massive amount of work that needs to be done in the government and in the parliament, and then you need to implement a lot of complicated laws on the level of government agencies. Sometimes you need to build completely new institutions that didn't even exist before, and this does take a long time, and it requires a lot of determination, and you really need to mobilize resources and so on. And of course we realize that this is very difficult in a situation where you have experienced two very serious financial crises in less than a decade. You are also at war with a very powerful neighbor that has taken away part of your territory. We understand all of this. It again makes little difference to the final assessment of whether you actually comply with the criteria set for EU membership. So this is really the main thing. I mean, I think the difference in this sense between Poroshenko and Zelensky is very superficial. That would be my answer to that question.
Maria?
Yes, I'm not as a politician. I can be a little more pessimistic and optimistic and so on a more not so objectical. I am more pessimistic on the side of the EU, and that comes from. I mean, I come from a very small party in Sweden, and we get smaller by the day. And we had a conference, or when we were going to set our program for the European election coming up at the 26th of May. And I wanted to, and I pushed for, in that program, we should have very clear writings regarding Ukraine and Georgia and membership of the EU. Not just about sometime in the future we are welcoming Ukraine, Georgia, and we see positive on their path of and so on. But I wanted more sharp and more clear writings, and it was not my suggestion did not win so the writings in our European program is now more vague, coming to Ukraine and Georgian membership of the EU. And I come from a party who is very positive in terms of EU, in terms of enlargement and so on. And I think that the past experience in regards to Romania, in regards to Bulgaria and so on, has slowed down the eagerness of the enlargement of European Union, at least from the political side of it. So I'm not as optimistic when it comes to the EU to want to enlarge. I hope so. It's my personal, I do hope. I would want more clear writings on that and more clear speech on it. But I'm a bit more pessimistic. And I also think that in regards to Russia, we must keep in mind that the main aim of Russia in terms of the European Union is to rule and divide. And how do you do that? By keeping an ongoing war in eastern part of Ukraine. You make sure that the EU cannot become a member of the EU, as the EU cannot enlarge a country with an ongoing conflict. So that in itself is an aim for Russia. I mean, we see that in Georgia. We see that in Moldova with Pridnestrovia, conflict that we seldom talk about. So that is in itself an aim for Russia, to keep this conflict going and to divide the European Union, which we see Russia doing in several other ways.
Right.
You said what we see and what we should be afraid of. I think it would be good if you hold back on rhetoric and do the homework and put focus on doing domestic reforms. Because I think it a little bit, like Theodore Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick. If you transfer this to Ukraine, you should be low on rhetoric and high on will to reform and make your country prepared for joining. Because joining is not the important thing. The important thing is make your country fit to join.
Yeah, that is a good perspective. And given even this enlargement fatigue of the EU and member states, there is, from the side of the EU, might be some issues or some kind of prolongivity of the process. But what is the perspective from within Ukraine? How did the candidates or the president-elect in particular, how does he see the enlargement or potential of Ukraine to become a member state? Is it something that is prominent in his, was it prominent in his campaign, in his rhetoric?
In the Zelensky rhetoric.
Yeah, or to compare also Zelensky and Poroshenko, what is
because Poroshenko was very clear that we are going to EU, and he was like repeating it all the time. But with Zelensky, it was not clear what he's meaning, because he was saying that I'm ready to negotiate with Putin, and it made a lot of people angry because what it means, how to negotiate. But at the same time, he said it's not possible that you will withdraw this right to travel without visa. So this kind of visa issue was also big in Ukraine, and it still is. And Zelensky was ensuring everyone that no one can withdraw this right. But I don't know. He was not clear about what his view on this kind of relations is, so I don't know.
But given the internal politics, do you think there is a plausible scenario that that he could change foreign policy of the current government?
But the president, he can kind of strategically change something when he has support of parliament. I don't know which parliament we will have in half a year. Maybe it will be also a surprise. And I don't know, but right now it doesn't seem that it will be possible to change drastically, at least the rhetorics. But in practice, this is a very good question, what will be done in practice, because everyone seems to have this wish to have reforms working, but they are not. And whether Zelensky will do something for reforms or not, we will see. But he's not like almighty.
Right.
Well, I just can summarize everything, because I agree with everyone. Because yes, Ukraine is a country in war, and it is physical, it is hybrid war, and therefore my highest concern is well, the next steps that will be done as relation to the provocation that would totally appear from like Kremlin side. Therefore, concerned about the next steps, and also the issue of Crimea. I think we will maybe talk about this later more in details, but still the question of political imprisonment of Crimean Tatars who are oppressed there, and all this has to be somehow the policy has to be made on this. There have to be decisions, and this is the highest concerns, what to do with this, and also the question then with their reintegration. If one day we finish the war, if one day Donbass is deoccupied, what to do with these territories, what to do with people, how to reintegrate, and so all of these questions appear, and we don't have this clear understanding of what to do.
Right. And then I had a question that is probably more related to Maria, Martin, and Göran about the domains of current cooperation between Sweden and Ukraine, because everybody of you mentioned reforms and the necessity thereof. And indeed, these are important when we talk about potential, hypothetical accession to the European Union, but also possible joining of NATO one day in many years. So what are the current collaboration between Sweden and Ukraine, and what are the domains in which you have collaboration? Göran, you've been working in the parliament for quite many years, so you can also have a historical perspective, or give a historical perspective of how things...
Let me give one, what I see as one success story.
Yes, please.
The Swedish embassy in Kiev, they handpicked a handful of parliamentarians. This must have been in 2014, who came to Sweden for indoctrination, I would say, during a week.
Capacity building.
and got briefings how Sweden works. And I felt, when I was sitting in on this, I felt this is very Swedish. we think we are the best, so we tell everybody else how you should run a country. But actually, I had the pleasure to follow these people, and of course, some of them lost now in the election because the Minister of European Integration, for example, who has a too complicated name to pronounce for me, she was in it. And also I gave example of these young people who came in with education, and I've been able to follow them through their work in different committees in Rada now, and I think that was a good payoff for the Swedes. So I think those kind, and of course you guys, I have had the pleasure to follow you guys too, young Ukrainians.
Yeah, you've been a great friend of our
because
organization.
you are a capital for the country of Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians going abroad and study in different parts of Europe, and both what you learn in university, but also what you pick up from society. And I think that could be a source for Sweden to keep helping Ukraine by this going back and forth.
And to what extent these capacity building collaborations endure or continue in time? Martin, do you have many of those?
Yeah, I mean, most of our programs that we have are quite long term. I'm going to do the advertisement bit now. We have we are the 7th biggest donor to Ukraine, actually, Sweden, with some 240 million Swedish crowns per year in the current period. What we do is very much aimed at there's a broad umbrella of EU integration that also I mean, it's not only the kind of technical issues in the association agreement, but also softer issues having to do with democracy and human rights. So we do quite a bit of support to civil society. I mean, we don't work very differently from the European Commission, even though we can do, I mean, we do slightly smaller projects because we have less money for each one. But I mean, it's very much, the idea is very much that we support a reform that Ukraine wants to do. This is, I mean, when we work with the authorities, we don't impose anything. We don't come in with, you know, a pre-written proposal for a law or something. And I mean, we work with the reforms that Ukraine wants to do. That's very much the basis. There are a lot of success stories, I have to say, both for us and for the Ukrainian government, working with, I mean, in kind of a triangle with these younger parliamentarians, civil society, and the international community. This has worked very well in justice sector reform, for example. Those parts of the justice sector that have been successfully reformed. For our own part, I think the biggest success story that we have been involved in the last couple of years is decentralization reform that we do together with a couple of other donors, EU and Germany mainly. This has been very good. I actually went to SKL, Sveriges kommuner och landsting, which is kind of a interest organization of the regional and local authorities in Sweden, who are implementing a lot of this, and they explained very well how they had worked. And what was particularly nice was that they had some 25 Ukrainians who were now the champions of this project and going around Ukraine training people. So it's not, you know, we are not doing, we are not missionaries. we are just trying to help with some money, but it's really, I mean, nothing. This is the main message all the time, that nothing that we do can ever replace political will inside Ukraine. This is quite clear, and we do not want to impose anything on anybody.
Yeah. Maria, do Liberala have any collaboration on bilateral manner with Ukrainian parliamentaries or any other groups?
No, not at the moment, unfortunately. No.
Yeah. So maybe in the future there will be more.
Maybe we have. I just wanted to say something. Maybe not here, but there's something with the Ukrainian-Swedish relation, not in regards to policy and civil, on a civil society level, but also I wanted because there has been a debate in Sweden that Ukraine is somehow occupied by fascist or nationalistic or so on, and there's been this sub-debate in some of the newspapers ongoing. And I just want to say that this election also showed, because the party Svoboda, the candidate from there, who is the right-wing nationalist fascist, was only getting, 2% or something in the first round. And I think that's a statement, and I want that to be more. I personally hope that this debate, Ukraine being a fascist or nationalistic country, or that somehow being a subtext to the conversation, I hope this puts an end to that, because it's really, it's only rumors, and it tends to damage the reputation of Ukraine and the necessity of the change and development that's going on there.
Right.
Yeah, if I can just make a more personal reflection on that, this is not government policy, but I think Ukraine is very often used as a projection space to say other things. For example, that the EU is terrible, or the US is terrible, or NATO is terrible, and then you use this alleged fascists in Ukraine as an example. Of course, one good thing about the elections was that it dispelled very much this narrative, like Göran said, that Ukraine is somehow divided between an extremely nationalist western part and a pro-Russian eastern part. In fact, what we saw is a huge majority of Ukrainians voting for a candidate that is somehow neither of the two.
Russian-speaking and Jewish by
Yes.
nationality.
Yeah, exactly. That's that's Zelensky, but we can also take a person like Tymoshenko, for example, who to me doesn't come across as particularly pro-Russian or nationalist Ukrainian. So then you already have quite a large chunk of the population who thought something else was important when they cast their vote. And I think this was good for Ukraine's reputation, and it will be more difficult to make that argument now about a country which is divided in two halves.
Right. Yes.
I would like also to comment on this, because what we see is that how the reality deconstructs the myths, and the same situation was basically in 2014 when we had elections, because when Poroshenko got his victory in the first round, this also demonstrated that there were no clashes between pro-Russians or pro-Ukrainian division, and also the data showed that such parties as Svoboda that you mentioned, or that time also there was Pravый Sector, which was more radical. They didn't get, I don't remember, but like less than 1%, which is lower than the general European level of any right-oriented parties.
Right. Yeah. That is a good point indeed. Martin, you very nicely mentioned that Sweden takes quite an important role in different reforms in Ukraine, like decentralization and the justice reform. So that is very much needed, I would say. But also you say that this is very much demand-driven. If there is demand, if there is interest, and probably political will to reform a particular sector, then this cooperation will be initiated, right, from the side of the Ukrainian public officials. But then the question to the Ukrainian experts, Alina and Yulia, do you see any particular policy areas that are missing from these collaborations, or anything that we overlook when we talk about the need to reform, when we are being outside, and trying to project our wishes?
No, but absolutely, this is justice reform which is needed for the most, and I think that even during this between these two rounds period, it was really visible how this lack of reform of justice system plays against the Poroshenko, who probably could have been more interested in this reformation. So I think that this is the areas which are really the most important, and we are discussing them.
Mm-hmm. Alina?
Well, yes, so this is first, and the second one, as also mentioned before, there the vision on how we will reintegrate all the territories, so the policy on that as well, the long-term steps that have to be in our vision.
Yeah, I can just add that I think Sweden and the EU as well is doing a lot of thinking on that. I think there is a big general readiness to support a policy that would aim at the reintegration of these areas, and any kind of reach out to the people who still live there. Also, I think there's a move there's a lot of humanitarian aid to eastern Ukraine already. It's very difficult to deliver it beyond the contact line because of restrictions that are put up by the so-called People's Republics. There's nevertheless a readiness. I mean, there are people who try, and some who actually are able, but also to the side of the contact line, which is controlled by the government. And I think there's a willingness to move more towards real development projects there, and I think that would be important as well, just to show that there's some sort of positive future in that area that's not going to stay a war zone forever, and that I think is quite important. But again, this as well would depend on Ukraine having a very robust policy for how Ukraine wants to do this. I mean, we again cannot impose anything from the outside.
And from your experiences, what policy areas or cooperation in what policy areas meets the most resistance from the side of Ukraine? Are there any ideas that you try to propose which receive negative feedback?
Yeah, no, I would say this. What is really needed in Ukraine is to finish the reforms of whole sectors. I mean, you can take the justice sector, for example. There have been some great things done. The problem is that you can reform the police and you can reform certain courts, but then you need prosecutors to actually take cases from the police to the courts. And if you don't reform the prosecution, and also you still have unreformed courts, then this will not have much of a practical effect in reality, and this is something that we see across a lot of sectors. But I would really stress rule of law as the key area as we see it, and related to that, anti-corruption, to get all the institutions up and running and actually functioning independently, because this would also, I mean, Ukraine has very low levels of investment. In fact, if you look at the percentage of GDP, and this is, I think, because insecurity of, is your property safe if you invest? This is a question, I think, a lot of, so this also relates directly to living standards as well.
Absolutely, yes.
And may I raise a point where I see an enormous potential in Ukraine. If I look at it from an economic standpoint, from the sideline, both the human resources, a large and in large part educated population. If you compare with the tiny Estonia, it has some similarities. That you have a very skilled population in some fields. So, for example, in programming and things like that, you can. And if you look at it from another perspective, the potential for energy production, renewable energy production in Ukraine is enormous. So if we're talking about joining the European Union, I think if you're going to join the European Union, you need to bring something to the table. And energy, renewable energy could be one of those things. And of course you need a rule of law, because if you don't have the rule of law, investment and everything is meaningless. So you need to build it in that order. rule of law, but then not just looking at all the problems, and of course I see they are enormous, but the potential is extreme.
Absolutely. And I think that one question that leaves quite many people puzzled, and me sometimes as well, it is, well, of course, countries like Sweden and Norway are very much engaged into promoting democratic and human rights values in Ukraine, right? So taking very clear, active stand regarding the reforms and the necessity thereof. But then the broader question is, but why Ukraine is so important for Sweden in particular? Why is it necessary for us to think about what we can do, diaspora, Swedish government, NGOs, etc., governmental agencies? Why do we place so much emphasis on Ukraine?
Wants to start?
Well, no, I could start. I mean, what the main answer to this question, I think, is that it's, I mean, it's so easy to always see this through the narrative of the conflict, of course, but of course it's become more acute since then. But I think Sweden has a natural sympathy with other European countries who want to make their own independent choices, and this goes back quite a long time. So I think it has to do with certain view for us that European countries in particular should not be hostages to great power politics, and I mean this creates a kind of solidarity with those countries. So I think that's maybe where it comes from. If you go back to the Ukrainian independence in 1991, I hope this is the correct answer. I'm looking at the politicians here too. But then of course you can line up all sorts of things with about the European security order, and I mean this is very important as well. We have a set of rules for behavior between states in Europe, which we believe are being violated in Ukraine. And who knows who is next? This is kind of also a logic that makes it even more acute after 2014. So I think this is part of it. Also, it's close. I mean, it's have a lot of things happening in Ukraine that could affect Sweden directly and indirectly. All sorts of results from poverty and low living standards, and all that comes with it. We had, one very clear example a couple of years ago. There was an outbreak of polio in Ukraine because of poorly handled vaccinations, and also because of skepticism among the population of vaccines and doctors in general. This is not a disease that respects borders, and this is also something that for selfish reasons we need to address. So there's a whole host of reasons why Ukraine is important, I think.
Maria?
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back to Poltava, where we were not so. No, I will not repeat what you mentioned. I think that Ukraine has also proved to be a wake-up call in terms of the Swedish defense spending and so on. You mentioned the security order, and it's been an argument for Sweden to increase our spending, and given the situation with the occupied Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine. I am more puzzled. I mean, we have a great interest in Ukraine, and we support Ukraine on a policy level and in terms of development aid and so on. But I am still puzzled that it's not more done to focus on Crimea and to eastern Ukraine, and I mentioned earlier the Prenidnistrovia in Moldova, the South Ossetia in Georgia. I think that there should be more political attention to addressing these frozen conflicts, which, I mean, apart from Eastern Europe, Eastern Ukraine, the rest of them are frozen conflicts. And I think that politicians in Europe should pay more attention to solving somehow. I mean, it's incredibly difficult, of course, I know that, but we have a Minsk agreement that is broken every day, basically, in Eastern Ukraine. And I think more should be done in terms of that. And I have two very recent examples. We have a group in the Swedish Parliament working with human rights issues together with Amnesty, and I addressed if they had any political prisoners in Crimea that we could focus on, and they did not have any. And it's not because they do not exist, it's because the attention is not placed on Crimea in terms of these issues. So, and the same goes, we had a visit from the what do you call it, Journalists Without Borders? Journalists, yeah. And I also asked, what about your work in terms of Crimea, in terms of Eastern Ukraine? And they did not have any answer to that question. So I think that there is still a lot to be done in terms of focusing on Crimea, focusing on Eastern Ukraine.
Göran, from your perspective...
Yeah, I would give a slightly more cynic answer. To restoring the security order in Europe is of a very big interest for Sweden. And Ukraine was the biggest violation of it. And if we let the Russians get away with that, that makes the Swedish situation much worse. So for that cynic reason, Sweden should be interested in Ukraine. And of course, then there is this more idealistic thing. And of course, Sweden is very often down to business. And Ukraine is both historically, being from Roslagen myself, it's an enormous potential, both as a market and a place to put production and trade.
Right, because of close proximity to Sweden.
Yeah, and where it's at, because it has everything for it. It has the geopolitical location. Of course, the difficult thing is that Russia is a neighbor, but otherwise strategically located with a big population and with almost all natural resources. And still it is a basket case and not a bread basket.
From your perspective, Selina and Julia, do you have anything to add on why Ukraine should be paid attention to for Swedish society, Swedish...
I think both approaches, as they're fairly cynical, and also the value issues are important. And by the way, maybe you know that there are some companies that are like Swedish companies that are located in Ukraine, and for example, they're producing rocks made by Swedish designers, and then that are then very famously sold all over Europe. So something from high fashion, and even their royal family, when they visited several years ago the place where the old Swedish village is located, Zmiivka, I think they visited this place with the rocks. And so, so there are already examples of this sort of cooperation of Swedish-Ukrainian companies that are quite famous worldwide in their target market.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is very important for European security.
Yeah.
It's no way to ignore it. So.
Yes. Yeah. And then Maria, you started in your contribution. You started bringing up the question of we don't talk about Ukraine enough, right? So we still look out some particular issues. And I was just wondering, what other issues do we forget when we talk about Ukraine? Because justice reforms and corruption, that is something that comes up all the time, right? But then what are we missing? If we were to live in a better world, what would you want us to look into once we solve the problems that we are now facing?
Oh, that's a bit of a difficult question. I mean, apart from what I already said about focusing more on putting pressure on Russia to resolving the conflict or withdraw from Crimea and eastern Ukraine, I'm not sure, but you have to fill in for me. But there is, I hope I don't see a conservative tendency in Ukraine. I am sometimes a little bit worried about that, because we, as Sweden, of course, we hope when we export our values and so on, we tend to think that we export liberal values all the way. But I mean, it's not possible, and we should not, maybe. But I actually want to hear from you if you see any conservative tendency in Ukraine, and if we should be worried about them, or if you part or opposed see a more liberal tendency in the Ukrainian society.
When you were speaking about this view on Ukraine as a fascist or nationalist country, I was immediately thinking that yes, indeed, if you read Swedish media, you read about this fascist in Ukraine, so that you are afraid to go to this country. But on the other hand, what is really missing, like during these 5 years, we had really for the first time very massive pride in Kiev, and it was very difficult in the beginning for the government to ensure the security and everything, but still it was really like a massive parade, and a lot of people were there, and it was the first time in Kiev that so massive parades took place. So I think that this picture is totally missing in media, and this is deplorable in a way. But I also share only like liberal values, and what I think that what was kind of maybe very disadvantageous in Poroshenko's period, that he was kind of not clear enough that on his views on conservative values, because he was meeting the people from very conservative circles who have very conservative views on families, and for many it was like a huge risk for voting for him. Although in politics, like in policies, he was not issuing any laws which would go against these liberal values. But on the discursive level, it was already kind of it drowned some bells for some people that it was kind of not liberal enough or something. But on the other hand, all these NGOs and very, very active people in Ukraine, they were supporting Poroshenko during the campaign, and the intellectuals who are for liberal values, they were also supporting Poroshenko as a person they believed in like going on to develop these values. So I hope that during Zelensky time it will be prides in Kiev, and they will be secure places.
I would also like to add that, well, changing of the values is a very long-term process, and we still have a lot of legacy from the Soviet period. This is clear. So a lot of conservatism. But if we take large-scale data on values like Engelhardt make, we see that there is certain transformations, and quite rapid. In some spheres, less visible in others. But maybe and in in relation to the previous the question of Sweden-Ukrainian relation and support, probably the newer NGO that have appeared in 2014 or before, but they were really boosting their energy through these 5 years, are those elements that could be supported, and because they are these transmitters or providers of these liberal values, and there are a lot of them are very good, but not visible that much, dealing with human rights, but also with animal rights, and a lot of them. So probably more attention to the NGOs and the providers could be also beneficial.
Right, so instead of directly working with governments, more support for grassroots movements that are working on the ground.
Cases, yeah.
Yes, yes. So it's something that that indeed would have helped
and
to build capacity as well. On
And
the
plus,
local level.
since we have the parliamentary elections, I think that newer parties will come, and probably the support of youth and youth parties that are growing at the moment, and they have this probably chance to get to the parliament, could be supported at least in media or
Study visits.
Yes, yeah. In different by different options.
Yeah, capacity building, not indoctrination. Right, yeah. I think that is about a good time for us to open up for the questions from the audience. You're welcome to raise your hand. Please present yourself. What is your name? And ask your question. Please. Yes?
My name is Per Blid. I've served as a defense attaché in Moscow for 8 years. And I'm a little bit worried. We have spoken about the newly elected president, Zelensky, that he doesn't have a clear program. I'm a little bit worried that he will not be able to create his program because he will be tested from the Russian side. The offer of Russian citizenships for people in Donetsk and Luhansk will just be the first step. Yeah. And the Russians, they see a possibility now that he says at some place that he's ready to negotiate with the Russians. That's good. Then the Russians can achieve their goals with, at the negotiation table. If not, they can achieve them by force. So I'm a little bit afraid that this will be a very hot summer in eastern Ukraine in many ways. And my question is, how can we support Zelensky to actually create his own policy, not to answer on someone else's trying to take the initiative? Right. And how could we support the democratic movements we have seen in Ukraine and a free election and handover of power from the best from the Sweden and European Union part?
Thank you. Very interesting question.
But this is the question to Zelensky.
How can we support, right? As in Sweden. How can Sweden support?
I think very important support is to accept the outcome of the election and not trying to say it wasn't our candidate. A little bit like happened in the United States. In Sweden was a little bit reading only Washington Post. So even if the election result was very clear, Donald Trump won the Democratic election. And in Sweden they said, oh, it wasn't our candidate, so we can't accept this. Because we have read Washington Post. So even if Zelensky wasn't our candidate, he is in a democratic election clear winner. And accept that fact. And he seems to be a clever guy too, the way he handled that first test from Putin. Of course, as a comedian too.
Yeah, and that's also one of
and if he's a clever guy, because sometimes, having served in Parliament myself for 12 years, having political experience isn't everything. There is other abilities that is important too. So if he's a clever guy now, he take over a lot of the qualified people in the administration and build on that. And not trying to have all the answer himself.
Right.
But it's one thing to act as a president from a script on a TV series.
But one
one
of the best U.S. president all time was an actor by profession.
We will have 5 years to see.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting analogy to Georgia in 2012, where
Right.
there was again a democratic election, and the party in Georgia that won was led by people who really they came in with different tonality on the conflict. You have to say they said we will solve this. We will engage in a dialogue with Russia. And we will reach out to the people in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And if you look at what they were able to achieve, it was, certain things that are good in themselves and which nobody can be against. I mean, a little bit easing of the Russian trade restrictions and a little bit easier in terms of getting Russian visas and being able to travel to Russia, but in terms of the conflict, actually quite the opposite. And these infamous fences along the contact line started or continued to move even quicker than before. And I think if you see Russia as the main driver of these two conflicts, as we tend to do, then it's easy to make this analogy to Ukraine, that that you would expect them. Zelensky also came in with a slightly softer rhetoric, and he's met with exactly the opposite once he takes office. And the truth is, it's very difficult to do anything when you're dealing with a country which seems to be quite comfortable with things as they are, and you look all the time for some sort of Russian grand plan, and you also look for a clever person in Ukraine who will solve this. I think the sober way to look at this is that it will be roughly the same for quite a long time, with small things changing on both sides, because that's what we've seen everywhere else. So that I think is what one should be prepared for, and then I think it's with the conflict, it's important to. I mean, this is not an ethnic conflict to begin with, but the fact that it's going on and what is happening on the ground is creating a lot of animosity between people living on each side of the contact line. And I think countering that is probably the most important thing for that Ukraine can do, both in words and in deeds, because otherwise you risk having an artificially created animosity between people on each side of the contact line that wasn't even there in the beginning, that was created because of shelling and shooting back and forth for years and years.
Yeah, please present yourself.
Svetlana Kuzichenko. I represent here ANTRA Sweden. It's Adventist Agency of Development in Sweden. So it's a charitable organization, and as a worker in a charitable organization, I can see that such a government organization like SIDA and many others that are providing charitable organization in Sweden that are sponsoring other countries. They place Ukraine in the fourth group of priority, which is the last group of priority for humanitarian needs, AIDS. Do you believe that, and that was a tendency within the last 5 years, basically what had happened in Ukraine, what we could observe, that the humanitarian needs were increasing, but European humanitarian aid was actually decreasing. And Sweden was also part of it. To me, it is strategically illogical because I would like, if I were on the place of Swedish government or politicians, I would like to help to the country which is on the side of the euro, to help people, poor people, to fight their poverty. Because otherwise we come to the result when the poor people is having tendency to vote for stopping war by any means, even becoming a part of Russia. And to me, the results of this election are saying that Ukrainian bigger part, majority, part of simple Ukrainian people, not highly educated, maybe not elite, have chosen a more loyal to stopping, more loyal candidate that might stop the war by any means.
Thank you for your question. So the question.
So the question is, how do you believe if the Swedish government or Swedish establishment can help to move Ukraine from the fourth part of priority group of helping with humanitarian aid to more higher priority? How to do it? Because for the reasons that I declared earlier. Do you understand my question?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, now I'm going to get a little bit technical. There are two kinds of aid that we provide to Ukraine. One is, or there are several kinds, but the two major ones are development assistance, and the other one is humanitarian. There is the argument that you are making and that I am also making internally, that Ukraine is of particular importance to Sweden and we should really focus on it. The reverse argument is that when we distribute humanitarian assistance, then we have to compare, we really have to compare the suffering in one place with the suffering in another. And it's hard to argue that people in Yemen, for example, are better off than in Donbass. And then on the more development assistance side, you also hear this argument. I mean, the Swedish assistance to Eastern Europe in general is questioned a lot from time to time, because Ukraine is not a poor country if you look at this globally. It's a very poor European country. But globally, I mean, there is no case for doing poverty reduction in Ukraine, and the result that we have in Sweden and elsewhere is, as very often, a compromise. That's my boring answer to this, that we have not as much money as Ukraine would need, but more than it would deserve based on simple poverty calculations.
Ukraine is in the group with such countries like that are more prosper, like Romania, Albania, Serbia. So it belongs to this group, but Ukraine, or Georgia, for example. But like you said, Ukraine is having an open military conflict, which is not frozen, so it cannot be compared to this group of countries.
That is a very complicated question, right? We had another question, right, Nick?
Yes,
please.
I've read an interesting speculation, which is that Zelensky is in fact could be carrying out the agenda of an oligarch who owns the TV station that airs his popular comedy, and who's also been supporting his campaign. So how likely do you think that this is the case?
Well, that's very interesting because we haven't mentioned Kolomoisky.
Right. Not deliberately.
He's like Voldemort.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And well, it looks like, of course, it is very visible by the people who stands behind the Kolomoisky, like the lawyer who also supports Zelensky during his campaign, and other people from Kolomoisky in the team of Zelensky. So it looks like, yes, they have common ground, and also the president, the situation with the bank, which came just out of blue on the eve of their elections or the day after or something like this, makes it clear. But well, Ukraine has the oligarchic systems in the 90s. I mean, I don't like this sort of traditions, but we have the competing oligarchs, and even this makes Ukraine less predicted and more competitive, because there are more different clans, different teams that don't have this vertical of power, and that would just agree on everything. And so I hope that one day we would be able to make through different anti-corruption measures, these people, they're businessmen, and they would be more distant from the power. So far, it is not the case. Yeah.
They want also to contribute on the Kolomoisky case. One quick last question, please, if you have any. No. With that, I would like to thank our contributors to the panel. Thank you very much for finding time to come here. And to our audience, thank you for coming to listen to the panel discussion rather than celebrating Valborg. Thank you. We all deserve a round of applause.